Welcome to iaith, the home of modern Welsh politics. There are only a handful of items in our collective memory in Wales with the widespread cultural recognition of the Welsh Not. For some, it is a symbol of cultural imperialism, just another entry in the long-standing friction between Wales and England. For many, at the time of its use, it was a tool of betterment, modernising education to embrace the value of speaking the English language. It's divisive, it's political, and it has remained misunderstood and misinterpreted over the centuries. With his latest book, Professor Martin Johns delves into the historical reality of the Welsh Not and how and why its legacy persists. And we're delighted to be joined by him on the pod to discuss it today. Hello, Martin.
Hello.
Thank you very much for joining us. And firstly, a huge congratulations on this book. You know, it really looks at this subject through the prism of the people of Wales and their interests and influences. We're going to be talking a lot about what the Welsh Not isn't or wasn't, but to start with, for anyone who isn't familiar with the subject, can you tell us, when we say the Welsh Not, what do we actually mean?
Okay, so the Welsh Not was a wooden board, essentially a small piece of wood. It did vary in size according to where in Wales it was, but a small piece of wood. On it was carved sometimes the letters WN, sometimes just the word Welsh. Sometimes it actually said Welsh Not or Welsh Note as well, because it was often called the Welsh Note rather than the Welsh Not. So it's a piece of wood, a token, if you like, and it was used in some 19th century schools. When a child was heard speaking Welsh, it was given to the child. In some places, it was hung around their neck. In other places, they just put it on their desk or they held it in their hand. And then normally they would pass it on to another child in the classroom if they heard them speaking Welsh. And it would circulate around the classroom. And at the end of the day, there would be some kind of punishment. In some places, that was physical, it was corporal punishment. Sometimes only the last person to hold it had it was punished. Sometimes it was every child who'd had it during that day. Sometimes it was standing in the corner. Sometimes it was detention or lines. There was a whole variety of different punishments, but essentially it was a piece of wood given to children in 19th century schools as a punishment for speaking Welsh.
So can you talk to us a little bit about the timescales of when this punishment was used?
So it's actually really difficult to be precise. And even in the 19th century, people were arguing about this very question. The earliest mentions of it come from the very end of the 18th century, actually in North Wales, where the first account calls it the Welsh lump. It was a piece of lead in that case, rather than a wood. Most of the mentions of it in contemporary sources, and by contemporary sources, I mean things written at the time by people who saw it being used, or remember it being used. Most of those contemporary accounts date it to the first half of the 19th century. But undoubtedly, in some parts of Wales, its use continues much later, right through the 19th century and maybe even into the early 20th century. But the evidence on that is quite sketchy. But it was at its most common in the first 50 or so years of the 19th century.
So in the book, I think you tried to describe the age of the Welsh Not as being the period up to 1862, where this sort of device was used all across Europe in school environments to push students away from one language or another. In the book, you also talk about an 1832 story of an English Not of sorts. So it's not really a Welsh-specific phenomenon, is it?
So what we have to understand about the Welsh Not is what was it actually trying to do? Now, the word Welsh Not, sums up the fact that it was trying to stop people speaking Welsh. But the big question is it trying to stop them speaking Welsh full stop, including out of school, or is it just trying to stop them speaking Welsh in the classroom? And again, it's not very easy to be, 100% precise on this because different teachers had different motivations. But I argue in the book that the majority of people using the Welsh Not were not so much trying to stop the children speaking Welsh full stop. They weren't trying to stamp out the language. They were trying to stop children speaking Welsh in the classroom in order for these children to learn English better. People saw the Welsh Not as a tool to teach English. That was the key thing about it. It's a little bit like a simulation kind of immersion classes today where you encourage children when they're learning a new language to speak the new language as much as possible and to not use their mother tongue. And again, if we encourage, Welsh or French in the classroom, whatever it is, we're not necessarily trying to stop that child speaking their mother tongue full stop. We're just trying to get them to practice their new language. And that's how it was seen in the early 19th century, I think. For the majority of teachers, it was a tool to learn the language. And one way we can see that is there are similar tools in other cultures. Now, sometimes these are against minority languages where there was considerable hostility towards that language. Breton in France would be an example. But the most interesting one is the one that you mentioned, where in the 1830s there is this mention in a private school for English girls where the children are learning English. Sorry, where the children are learning French. There is this similar wooden board with the word English written on it, and it's passed to children who speak English rather than French. And in that case, whoever had it at the end of the day pays a small fine. So there is a common root here across Europe where almost like tools of shame are used, where you identify the child who has done something wrong, in order to encourage them to do the right thing. Now, that might seem quite cruel to us now, but the important thing to remember is that is how education in the early 19th century worked. These humiliation tools, these tools of shame, are really common in lots of different environments. It's not just about language learning. There's one school which trained teachers, which encouraged teachers to use almost like a piece of paper or a piece of board around their necks where you could write in what the crime of the child was, and they would have to kind of show their crime to the rest of the class. One person remembers at his school in Wales that when a child got a sum wrong, that the rest of the class would make a circle around that child and they would all point at him saying, fool, fool, fool. Some schools used the dunce cap, which was essentially a paper cap with the word D or fool written on it, and they would have to wear it to show they had done something wrong. So in the early 19th century, shaming kids for doing something wrong was seen as an educational method. If you shame them for the bad thing, then they will increasingly do the good thing. But in language, the question becomes, is doing the bad thing just about what's happening in the classroom, or is it about something wider? And I argue in the book that the vast majority of teachers weren't trying to stamp out the Welsh language because it made no sense to do so. We're talking about an era where, the vast majority of Wales is Welsh monolingual. And it would actually disadvantage children not to be able to speak Welsh because they wouldn't be able to function in their communities. Speaking Welsh was an important kind of social asset, just as speaking English was. So I think that in most cases, the Welsh Not was about trying to create a bilingual Wales rather than an English-speaking Wales. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't some teachers who think Welsh is old-fashioned and backwards and best got rid of. But by and large, the tool is used by Welsh-speaking teachers who are trying to help their children learn English. And as much as it seems cruel now to humiliate them and to hit them, that's how education worked. Children got beaten, they got humiliated. That was what school was like.
Without going into sort of pedagogy of why that was the wrong choice, Martin, just focus on the language element of it for a moment and talk a little bit about the context of both the English and Welsh languages at the time. Why would teachers be trying to focus on the improvement of people's English beyond it being trying to create a bilingual Wales? Were there sort of state apparatus that meant that it was beneficial for people to be speaking Welsh above English?
So we are talking about an era when education is run by local communities, by churches, by chapels. It's not something run by the state. Increasingly, gradually, as the 19th century goes on, there is state funding available to schools, but it's essentially on a grant system. The state doesn't control any of these schools. It doesn't employ any of the teachers. So schools are run in the community. And by and large, these are working class communities, in industrial areas. They're kind of, they're dominated by iron or coal. In rural communities, they're dominated by agriculture. But we're talking about an era of kind of poverty and hardship, where to work on the land was tough, especially in rural Wales, where the Welsh Not was most common. People are living on subsistence diets. They're not having much meat. They're living off very basic vegetables, potatoes, cheese if they're lucky, a bit of bacon, maybe once a week. Life was tough. People worked long hours. They lived in, hard conditions, terrible housing. I mean, today when you go to St. Fagans and you look around some of the old cottages, they seem quite quaint. But of course, the cottages that survived to be re-erected at St. Fagans are the wealthier ones, the bigger ones. Your farm labourer, your agricultural labourer in the early 19th century lived in essentially a hut that had gales blowing through it, that was wet, that was damp, that was, tough. Life was tough. That's the point I'm trying to get across. And one chapel minister in North Wales said that everyone in his community looked around and they saw that everybody who had a job that didn't break your back. In other words, everybody who didn't graft and labor for a living spoke English. If you wanted to get out, to get on, or indeed to get out of those communities, you needed English. So when parents want their children to learn English, when schools want their children to learn English, it is to help those children move up, as it would have been perceived, the social ladder. It is a way of escaping poverty. Now, of course, the reason why English is the language of progress is because of the way the UK worked. It was dominated by England. English was the language of the state, of business, of the economy. And the unequal nature of the relationship between English and Welsh is a product of the unequal nature of the relationship between Wales and England. I'm not trying to kind of excuse, the status of the two languages, but undoubtedly, people weren't doing this as a political decision. They were doing it to help their children. And what does most parents want for their kids? They want their kids to have an easier life than they did.
A bit ironic now when you look at 2020s in South Wales, you see a lot of parents who would send their kids to Welsh school for exactly the same reason, right?
Exactly. And the dynamics of language have completely reversed. Now the question is, how do you teach Welsh better? How do you get people to be more confident in speaking their Welsh? And why do you want to teach Welsh in the first place? And it is partly about national identity for many parents, but it's also about that there is a perceived status to the Welsh language and a perceived use to it in the workplace.
And there's a couple of things I want to pick out from your last answer, Martin. So throughout the 1800s, obviously, two major developments are happening in education and schooling. As you said, the Church of England and other religious schools were beginning to take hold in Wales, and this prompted a bit of a response from the largely Welsh-speaking non-conformist chapels. What is the role of religious culture in relation to the Welsh Not?
So the key question is, what is the role of religious culture in relation to education, first of all? Religion is the driving force behind education, behind the spread of education, partly because there was a sense that you want children and adults to be able to read the Bible. And if you can't read the Bible and if you can't understand the word of God, how are you going to reach heaven? Essentially, I'm simplifying it, but that is essentially what it comes down to. So promoting reading was about giving people access to salvation, essentially. So religion is a real driving force within education. But in Wales, it's complicated by the relationship between the Anglican Church and nonconformity, the chapels. The Anglican Church was a minority religion in Wales, and it saw education as a way not just of bringing people closer to God and heaven, but also bringing people closer to the Anglican Church and away from the chapels. So Anglicanism is ahead of the chapels in promoting education, and it's a real driving force in the expansion of education in the early and the mid 19th century. And once the chapels start seeing that happening, then their religious charity, which was called the British Society, they start putting a lot of effort into promoting education. So you have this rivalry between the Anglican Church and the chapels to provide education. And sometimes, and even in small communities, you have a church school and a chapel school really close to each other. And what that meant was that they were in competition for pupils because you had to pay to go to school at this era. I mean, some schools, worked on a charitable basis, and if the parents couldn't afford it, then the parents would be let off the fees. But most people paid 1 or 2 pence a week, which wasn't a huge sum of money, but given the poverty that existed, it did require sacrifices by many parents. So the church schools and the chapel schools are in competition for pupils. They know that school education requires a sacrifice from the parents in order to send the kids there. So what I'm getting at is that the schools had to do what the parents wanted. That if you taught in a way that that the parents didn't like, you were going to lose those pupils. So the role of language in all of this is really about doing what the parents want. And what the parents wanted, and every single social commentator in the 19th century agrees on this, whether they speak Welsh or they don't speak Welsh, is they wanted their children to learn English. Now, again, that doesn't mean turning your back on the Welsh language, and that the churches were particularly sensitive about this because they realized if you want people to to come over to the church and to leave the chapels behind, they have to understand how the religion works. And if you do it all in a foreign language, you know, even though you might be giving something to the kids if they're learning English, if you're turning off the parents, you're turning them off the church as well. So the church schools are actually quite sensitive about using some Welsh in order to actually spread their message. But overwhelmingly, the key goal of education, whether it's church or chapel driven, is to teach children English. Because you also had Sunday schools, and Sunday schools taught children to read in Welsh. Very rarely to write in, well, not very rarely, but not so much to write in Welsh, because the key goal of literacy wasn't really about writing, it was about being able to understand the Bible. So the chapel schools didn't feel they needed to teach Welsh because the Sunday schools are there for that. So whether it's church or chapel, it's really about teaching English. But the chapels had this other side to them, the Sunday schools, which did teach children to read Welsh, which again is when you, as a parent, if you send your kids to an English school, you weren't turning your back on the Welsh language because you probably also sent them to a Sunday school where they would learn to read Welsh.
Very interesting. I was just wondering how the Catholics got on with all their Latin masses pre-1960s. Well, the Latin was spread across Wales. But we've talked a little bit about the church's interaction with education, but now moving a bit more towards the state. During this period, the state did begin to emerge as a more dominant influence in education, professionalizing teaching, creating standards, school inspectors. Obviously, you could talk about the infamous blue books that painted a pretty awful picture, actually, of Welsh society. But again, your analysis does sort of say that the state wasn't actively hostile to Welsh. So how would you characterize the British state's approach to Welsh education at the time?
Well, the first thing to say is the British state is not like a monolithic institution. It consists of lots of different people with lots of different ideas. So there isn't a single British state view of the Welsh language, and attitudes did vary. I mean, if you take the Blue Books as the beginning point, so the Blue Books are an inquiry in the 1840s into the state of education in Wales. What that is driven by is the political unrest in Wales. Looking back to the Merthyr Rising, the Chartists and the Newport Rising, the Rebecca riots, there was a sense that why are the Welsh so rebellious? What's going on there? And there was a belief that maybe the problem is they don't speak English and therefore they can't really understand, the benefits of being part of Britain and various things. It's all very patronizing, but there was a sense that the problem in Wales was that they speak Welsh. So an inquiry is held to look into, why aren't more children learning English? What's wrong with these schools? And three commissioners, they're essentially lawyers, are sent around. They all speak English. They're all English. They all go around Wales and they look at the state of education. And they report back that everybody wants to learn English, but that's not the issue. The problem is how English is being taught. And they point to the fact that schools are operating in the medium through the medium of English. And they point to the Welsh Not as an example of the problems of this. Their argument, and they're right because they're not the only people who are saying this, but essentially what is happening in education in the middle of the 19th century is that you've got a teacher and he would read to his class, often from the Old Testament. And if you think, if you've ever picked up the Old Testament, it's not simple, clear English. It's not the cat sat on the mat. So the teacher would read from the Old Testament. The kids would read and repeat after him. And that was learning English. And unless the teacher explained to any of these children what any of these words meant, what these passages they were reading meant, the children were really just learning to repeat things. And often they were doing it so many times, they were doing it from memory. They weren't even recognizing the words on the paper. So yes, you might have the odd visitor who comes into the school and he hears this classroom reading some words from the English Bible. He's like, oh, that's very good. Well done. But when they actually ask the children questions in Welsh, what does what you've just read mean? Children didn't have an idea. So what was happening in schools that children were learning to read without understanding what they were reading. Now, in the best schools, that didn't happen because the teacher would explain to the kids. But in the worst schools, where the kids had been shamed and beaten for speaking Welsh, then they are literally just learning to repeat English words. They're not learning the language. So the whole argument of the Blue Books was, if you don't use Welsh in the classroom, you are failing the children because they are not learning English properly. And the Blue Books criticised the Welsh Not as an example of what they called, or what they essentially see as the idiocy of education and the way education works. The argument of the Blue Books is essentially you have to use the Welsh language in the classroom in order for children to properly learn English. Now, they say this and they lace it up with kind of a load of really prejudicial, kind of snobbish comments, not just about the Welsh language, but about Welsh women, about morality, about sexual habits, all kinds of things. And that's what angered people. And that's why the Blue Books have such a kind of virulent reputation in Wales because of all of those other comments. What very few people disagreed with the Blue Books on was the idea that you should teach children English. Now, the Blue Books kind of assumed that once people have learned English, then the Welsh language will probably die away. Because why would you carry on speaking Welsh if you can speak English? English is the language of modernity, of civilization, etc., etc. So it's not that they're saying we have to stamp out the Welsh language. They're saying we need to use the Welsh language in order to teach children Welsh better. And in order to teach English better. But once we've done that, children will probably stop speaking Welsh of their own accord, because why would they keep it on? So again, it's not that there's this deep hostility. We must beat children for speaking Welsh. The state's idea is we have to get them to learn English, and then they'll probably stop speaking Welsh of their own accord. Because how do you actually stop people speaking the language? You can't go into their homes and punish them. Linguistic change is a very complicated long-term process, and the state didn't have the means to make it happen. So I've given you a very long answer to basically kind of to boil that down. The British state had no real love for the Welsh language, on the whole, but it also didn't have the inclination, I don't think, to try and stamp it out. Instead, it had a sense that as long as we teach them English properly, which does mean using the Welsh language, then Welsh will probably die its own death. Now, there were some people within the state who were more sympathetic. Some of the schools inspectors who were set up to basically go and visit schools to make sure that these charity grants were being used properly. Some of them are Welsh speakers. Some of them are very sympathetic to the Welsh language. Others were quite hostile to it. There isn't a single view. And most people in the British state knew very little about Wales. It's like when the Blue Books come out, the reaction in Wales was anger, but actually the reaction in England was, not a lot really happened. The only policy change that happens after the Blue Books is a grant is introduced for teachers who are able to speak Welsh. They get paid more, basically. The state gives an extra grant to schools to pay Welsh-speaking teachers a little bit more, and that's meant to be an encouragement to have Welsh-speaking teachers. But that's the only policy change. So ironically, we have the blue books which come out, they attack the Welsh language, but the only policy change is actually Welsh-speaking teachers, if they pass an exam in Welsh, get paid more.
It's amazing how history rhymes, isn't it? Both in terms of concerns over teaching methods in Wales, but also in terms of how we prioritise teaching the Welsh language. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
I think we want to skip a little bit ahead, look at the start of the 20th century. Obviously, by that point, the language, replacement's the wrong word, but you know what I mean, was kind of well underway in Wales, and the living memory of the Welsh Not had sort of started to fade. But new narratives about the causal role of the Welsh Not in potentially fatally wounding the Welsh language has started to emerge by that. You start the book, don't you, with a story from the MP O.M. Edwards. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so by the end of the 19th century, people are starting to worry about the future of the Welsh language. It's clear that in the industrial regions, the language is declining. And people kind of worry about, well, how can we stop that happening? But it also creates debate about, well, why has this happened? And the reason why English takes root in Wales in the second half of the 19th century is twofold. Number one, education gets better. Increasingly, Welsh is used in the classroom. Children are set vocabulary tests. They're set translation tests. Instead of just learning to read English words without understanding what they're reading, they're taught to understand English. They're taught to speak English. Education is becoming more professional. Teachers are more trained. It's becoming more reflective. And increasingly, Welsh is used in the classroom as an instrument to teach the English language. Now that means they stop kind of punishing children for speaking Welsh. Not universally, because what was happening in some schools was that the teacher might speak to the children in Welsh, but the Welsh children weren't allowed to speak back to the teacher in Welsh. So Welsh is used to explain things, but the kids are meant to speak English only. The other thing that's happening in the late 19th century is there's a more celebration of childhood, that, you should celebrate kids. This is the era of Santa Claus and the growth of Christmas culture, of great children's literature. There's a romanticization of childhood. And the idea that you humiliate them, you slap them, you beat them for every little thing they do wrong is going out of fashion. So education is becoming more advanced, sophisticated, but it's also becoming less harsh. And all of that helps children to learn the English language. So children are learning English better. The other thing that's happening is people are moving into Wales in the industrial regions. The boom in the coal industry in the late 19th century brings in mass levels of migration into Wales. And what that does is give people who are now learning English better at school the opportunity to practice their English and to develop their English. And unlike in the countryside, English is there something that you can carry on using after you leave school. And remember, people are leaving school at like 12 or something. And in the countryside, even if they've been to a good school, if you're in a completely Welsh-speaking community, you might have learned English till 12, but by the time you're 20, you've forgotten most of what you learned because you just haven't kept it up. But in the industrial areas, people are keeping it up. So in the industrial areas, that dynamic of migration changes everything. And Wales essentially has the same education system. So the question is like, why is it in the industrial areas that Welsh declines, not the rural areas? And that, to me, sums up that it can't be about how the languages were treated in school. Because whether you're in rural Wales or industrial Wales, education is in English. The difference between rural Wales and industrial Wales is migration. Now, that's not there are pockets of industrial Wales where there isn't migration, like the Swansea valleys, and the Welsh language lasts much longer there. But when people move in from England, the language starts to change, and you start to find change in families. So you might have one generation, they've learned English at school, they're getting better at it through carrying on, and they're raising the children in Welsh because that's their language, that's their mother tongue. Their children are far more surrounded by English. They might be able to speak Welsh because they've learned it at home, but increasingly they're speaking English to their friends in the workplace. And when they choose to have children, they choose to raise their children in English. And that's the big question. Is that generation who takes that decision to raise the children in a different language to the one they were raised in. And that is the generational, that is their decisions that essentially hurt the Welsh language. And that raises the question, why did they do that? Why don't they raise their children in the language that they had been brought up in? And by then, they're seeing the Welsh language is in decline because of all this migration. And that's really key to it. They're increasingly starting to think, well, there's no future to Welsh. It's this language of older people. It's the language of the past. What's the point of passing it on? Now, for their parents, the key reason to pass it on was it was the community language. But once it stops being the community language or starts to shift, starts to ebb away, then there's not that imperative to pass it on. And the other key factor then is religion. And religion is so important to the survival of the Welsh language. Because if we go back to the middle of the 19th century, you might have blue books saying the Welsh is an uncivilized language. You might meet an English tourist who speaks down to you because you speak English. You might know that you might have been humiliated in court or dealing with some local official because you couldn't speak English. But if Welsh is the language of the church, of the chapel and the church, if Welsh is the language that you get married in, that you're christened in, that you have your funeral in, if Welsh is the language that you hear the word of God in, that is going to give you the route to life ever after. This is not a backwards language. It doesn't matter what some English snob says. This is the language of God, of eternity, and of heaven. And the idea that there are people around who are shamed out of speaking Welsh because they had to put this board around them, that is totally offset by the power and the status that the language gets from being the language of religion. But what happens at the end of the 19th century? At the very same time that people are moving into Wales and changing the community linguistic, the dynamics of language on a daily basis, as English is coming more and more into these communities, as education is getting better, what is happening at the exact same time? The churches and the chapels are starting to retreat. So there are these new forces pushing English, and the one thing that supported the Welsh language, the one thing that Welsh had that kept it vibrant, God, the word of God, that fades. And that is fatal for the Welsh language. And where does religion fade fastest? In industrial urban communities. In the rural communities, religion lasts much longer, there's much less migration, and that is why the Welsh language remains strong in the countryside, whereas in the towns and the industrial communities, it's in deep trouble.
Why is that? Sorry, just go on to a religious bent for a moment. Why do you think that religion fades faster in those industrial areas?
So religion is also about community. That you go to church or chapel not just to hear the word of God, but to see your neighbors, because it's the done thing, because you might be shamed if you don't do these things. In larger urban communities, it's much harder for that social pressure, that peer pressure to exert itself on people, to keep them in the church and the chapel. It's also because new ideas are coming in, socialism is coming in. Now, socialism in the early days was very influenced by religion, but it also leads people to see, or at least some people to see religion, the world in different ways. There's new modern ideas coming in that for some people kind of challenge religion. It's also very practical things. Religion is also about entertainment. It's about seeing a friend. It's about being entertained by the great preachers and the great sermons. But if you can go to the cinema, if you can go to the football or the rugby, you don't need church or chapel to offer you to offer you entertainment. So it's complicated and there's no simple answer, but essentially there are rivals for people's time and people's attention and people's emotions in urban areas that simply don't really exist in the countryside or not at the same level.
Thanks, Martin. I mean, going back onto the Not, there is this sort of mythos around the Welsh Not that has gripped popular culture over the last century or so, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, even as people start looking around and seeing the Welsh language being in decline, that raises concerns. And the debates about around education, language in education, they start shifting from being around should we use Welsh in order to teach English better to should we teach Welsh for its own sake. Welsh is pushed within schools, and there are campaigns to actually teach Welsh, to teach Welsh in schools. They never really kind of take off because this desire to learn English, remains strong. But as these language dynamics change, people are trying to say, well, why did this happen? And as I said, the answers are actually kind of complicated sociological processes. They're about immigration, they're about the power of English, but above all, they're about the decisions that individual Welsh-speaking families made. But people want simple answers to complicated questions. And if you start saying, well, of course, the real reason why people stopped speaking Welsh was because they didn't teach it to their children, that's almost saying this is something that the Welsh inflicted on themselves. It's much easier and much more comfortable to blame some external factor. And it's not like the British state is free of, is free of guilt because there is no love for the Welsh language in the British state by and large, with the exception of a few individuals. The British state does really very little or nothing at all really to support the Welsh language. And the power of the British state and the power of the English language within the British state is one of the reasons why people take this decision. So it's not like the British state is completely free of blaming all of this, but it becomes much easier to imagine that the British state was actually trying to kind of
Mm.
stamp out the Welsh language. And when, and people kind of remember the bits about the blue books, they often misunderstand what they're remembering, but there are quotes in the blue books that kind of feed this idea that the British state wanted to stamp out the Welsh language. There's the idea that who runs schools, and often people are looking back and knowing, well, the state runs schools in my day, and therefore it must have run schools in the past, whereas actually it hadn't. So there's this misunderstanding of how much power the state actually had over education. So gradually, this idea grows up that the state was deliberately trying to kill the Welsh language. And as I said, it has, and I can't say this enough, it had no love for the Welsh language. And it would have quite happily seen the Welsh language die out. But it just doesn't have the means to do very much about that. And there are these individuals within the British state, like Owen Edwards, who is really a strong cultural nationalist. I mean, he's very pro-British Empire, he's an imperialist, but he loved Wales, you know, and he pushes for the Welsh language to be used in schools. There are these individuals, these employees within the British state who are cultural Welsh nationalists. So again, it's not a universal picture of the state hating the Welsh language, but basically this idea grows and grows that somehow the state had tried to deliberately crush the Welsh language. And it's just such an attractive story because it removes blame for what had happened from Wales to external factors, that it's grown and it's grown. You start to see people saying this even in the late 19th century. They're not saying it's happening in their lifetime. They said, oh, this is what was happening 50 years ago. But that story remains and it grows and it grows and it grows and it grows. But it's really based upon misunderstandings of things that were happening. But again, I don't want to let the British state off because the power of the British state is one of the reasons why you want to speak English, because it was the language of business and government. It helped you get on. And the British state didn't do enough to foster the Welsh language. But did it hate the Welsh language? Did it really want to crush it? It just didn't have the means to do that. I mean, we're talking about an era when the state had little involvement in most things in life. It doesn't even make children go to school until 1880. It doesn't make education free until 1890. These are very late. By and large, the philosophy of 19th century government was make it as small as possible. The idea that it would get involved in what language people spoke at home or prayed in, that was beyond the pale for most liberals or conservatives.
I don't know about you, Martin, but this kind of feeds into a narrative about Wales that we don't have our own agency, that we were robbed of our language without our own interaction with the levers that were present at the time. I mean, not my words necessarily on, and I'm definitely not putting these words in your mouth, but a sort of victim mentality that a lot of Welsh people have, but also the fact that we, like you said, we love a story of loss. We talk a lot about the sort of poetic impact on our nation from things like Tryweryn and Capel Celyn. We're speaking actually on the anniversary of the drowning of Capel Celyn. his friend of the pod, Richard Wyn Jones, always says, the quality of the writing about the loss of the devolution in 1979 was far greater than that, speaking about the victory in 1997.
And even going back to the stories of medieval Wales, there's stories of loss. I mean, Glyndŵr lost, Llywelyn lost. Um, yeah, it's easy to spin a kind of a tragic story, but hey, we're still here, ni yma o hyd.
Yeah.
Um, that is part of the story, but history is not black and white. But you can tell the story of 19th century Wales in a completely different way. Um, take the idea the English stole our coal. I mean, again, this was a private industrial revolution that happened. Some of the coal owners were English, but many, many of them were Welsh. You could tell the story of Welsh entrepreneurialism. You could tell the story of how Welsh people took advantage of the minerals in their area and built, a globally important industry that created immense amounts of wealth. The problem was they didn't share it out equally amongst the other Welsh people. They kept the vast majority of it for themselves. But nonetheless, there are heroes there of business. And what does Wales need? A strong private sector. And instead of saying, oh, look, the English stole our coal, you could tell the story of 19th century Wales as, look at our great entrepreneurs, look at what Wales did in the past. We could create a new energy revolution if we do it ourselves and if we keep the profits and share the profits out. And then when you come to language, instead of saying, oh, like, the British stole our language and beat it out of us, you could point to linguistic change can happen really fast if people want it to. And just as people could raise their children in English, they can raise their children in Welsh today. And education is only part of the story, but it can teach people a language. But what really needs to happen is communities need to adopt that language because people need to be able to practice the language and to keep it on. And today, far too many children learn Welsh at school and then never ever use it again in their lives. But if you can use the 19th century to point to how agency, as you put it, or power lies within Wales, we have the ability to shape the future of our own society and our own nation. It just requires us to take decisions and to act. And as long as we say the nasty English over there are stopping us doing things, we're stopping ourselves doing things by doing that. History is about people and people have agency. Of course, there are economic factors that kind of hold them back and stuff, but nonetheless, people can make choices and people can make decisions that change the course of society. And the 19th century is an example of that. So the loss, and that's all part of the story as well. But alongside of that is a different story of Wales that we could draw inspiration from, and we could create a better tomorrow if we just got over ourselves and stopped trying to blame the English for everything and realized our future lies in our own hands.
Why are we like this, to put it so bluntly? What do you think there is about the Welsh mentality that leads us down this path of feeling like we're constantly the victim?
I mean, it is tough, for any small nation next door to a very large nation, an incredibly powerful nation. It is difficult. Taking responsibility for things is difficult, it's challenging. It's maybe easier to blame others. Some of it is actually history is badly taught. And we teach it in a way that kind of encourages us to think about loss. We maybe need to teach it in a kind of a more positive way. So, there are lots of reasons. And I think we also need to be careful about exaggerating. I'm not saying everybody goes around and thinks, the nasty English are after us, but there's enough of that.
Martin, before you go, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about modern education and the state of the Welsh language in general now. I saw some comments from you the other day about the way the Welsh history is being taught in contemporary day for GCSE. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and your sort of general thoughts about the state of Welsh education as well?
I mean, I think it is important that children learn about, the history of their own nation. And I think, learning about children should learn more about Wales. And I do worry that the new curriculum, even though it's meant to kind of really emphasize kind of Welsh history, because it is so loose and there are no kind of mandatory subjects within history, that actually we're going to end up with something which is very diluted and something which is kind of wishy-washy. So I do worry that even though the government thinks it's made Welsh history mandatory, I mean, Welsh history's been mandatory since the end of the 80s, that actually not much is going to change. In terms of language, education is part of the story, but it can't be the only part of the story. And that's what the 19th century shows. If you want a vibrant language, you have to have the language spoken in the communities. And it was, that migration was it was the key dynamic in the 19th century. And unless you give people opportunities and reasons to speak Welsh outside the educational setting, it's going to be really difficult. And you also have to kind of think of the negatives of having Welsh, of just seeing Welsh as a language of education. Because if it's a language of education, it's not cool. And kids like to rebel. Just as in the 19th century, they rebelled about being told to speak English. They played all these games about circumventing the Welsh Not and kind of, they spoke Welsh because it was their language and because they were being told not to. Kids are naturally rebellious. And the same thing is true today. And it's the more you associate Welsh with just school, you lose that kind of desire to speak Welsh. You make it uncool. So to me, the future of the language, education has a role to play, but what will be key to the survival of the Welsh language is how it's perceived. What is its cultural status? Because that's what its negative cultural status is what led people to stop speaking Welsh, to passing on the language. And, unless you give Welsh a much stronger cultural value, it's going to struggle in the future. To me, there's no point having 1 million Welsh speakers who never use the language. It's much more beneficial to the future of the language to have 500,000 speakers who speak it every day. But education can't deliver that.
It's really interesting, Martin, because I think that chimes with me a lot because I learned Welsh at secondary school, went to an English medium school, and was fine at Welsh. Until I was 17, and I realized that other people spoke it outside of my school, and I could interact with other people from across Cardiff and Wales in a different language. And that's what motivated me to learn it more and become fluent in Welsh, is that it was a bit cool rather than it just being what I was taught in a classroom.
There's something wrong with our pedagogy in languages. Just as we couldn't teach English properly in the early 19th century, every kid in Wales learns Welsh from the age of 4 to 16. So why do the majority of children who come out of English medium education only able to speak Welsh after learning it for 12 years? What are we doing wrong in our schools in how we teach this language? And something isn't working there.
Oh, that's a whole nother episode, I think, somewhere. Martin, thanks so much for your time and for this book. It is great. Where can people find you on the internet now, on the socials, and where can they buy your book, most importantly?
Well, the book is actually free online. If you Google Welsh Not University of Wales Press from the University of Wales Press, you should be able to download a free PDF of it, or it's available in paperback from all good bookshops. I'm online at Martin Johns.
Wonderful. Martin, thank you very much again. If you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't forget to find iaith on all the socials at iaithpod. You can go to our website, www.walespolitics.com. And thank you very much for supporting us with your ears. But if you would like to do so with your wallet, you can go to www.patreon.com/iaithpod. Thank you for listening to iaith. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review.